Picture this, a sun-drenched kitchen in 1955 where everything gleams like a magazine cover. The coffee percolator bubbles rhythmically on the stovetop. A woman in a pressed cotton dress and pearl earrings glides across the linoleum floor, her heels clicking in perfect time with the cheerful jingle playing on the radio. Her lipstick is fresh, her smile is brighter. She places a perfectly arranged breakfast on the table just as her husband walks through the door, and she greets him like he's returning from war, not a night shift. But here's the question that haunts that picture-perfect scene. Was she born this way, or was she taught to be? Today, we're pulling back the floral curtain on one of the most quietly controlled generations of American women, the 1950s Housewife. We're talking about the etiquette classes, the charm schools, the how to please your husband manuals, and the cultural machinery that turned independent young women into obedient, perpetually smiling homemakers. If you love stepping back into vintage America and uncovering the stories beneath the surface, don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories like this one. The training didn't start with marriage. It started long before, in girlhood, in classrooms that smelled of chalk dust and floor wax, where young girls sat in rows learning more than reading and arithmetic. They were learning their place. In the 1950s, American schools offered something that feels almost unthinkable today: home economics classes that were mandatory for girls. These weren't casual cooking lessons. They were full-scale domestic boot camps. Girls as young as 12 learned how to iron a man's shirt with military precision, how to plan a week's worth of meals on a tight budget, how to set a table for guests they hadn't met yet. Teachers handed out mimeographed sheets with titles like The 7 Duties of a Good Wife and How to Keep a Happy Home. The classroom itself became a kind of stage rehearsal for married life. Girls practiced serving imaginary husbands. They learned the correct way to greet a man at the door, never with complaints, always with a smile. One popular textbook from the era, The Good Wife's Guide, actually instructed young women to prepare yourself before their husbands came home. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, be refreshed and interesting. The message was clear: your worth is measured by his comfort. And it wasn't just the schools. Churches reinforced this narrative every Sunday. Sermons spoke of women as helpmeets, designed by God to support and serve their husbands. Youth groups for teenage girls focused less on spiritual growth and more on wifely preparedness. There were workshops on Christian homemaking and submission with grace. The language was soft, wrapped in scripture and tradition, but the instruction was firm. A woman's highest calling was to marry, obey, and create a sanctuary for her man. Even dating came with rules that trained young women to defer, to wait, to follow. Etiquette guides told girls never to call a boy first, never to suggest where to go on a date, never to appear too smart or too opinionated. Popularity depended on being pleasant, agreeable, and just mysterious enough to be interesting, but never challenging. One guidebook from 1954 warned, "Boys don't like girls who argue or act like they know everything. Save your brains for helping him with his homework, not showing off your own." By the time a woman reached her wedding day, she'd already spent years in training. But the real education? That came after the honeymoon. The 1950s housewife wasn't just maintaining a home, she was performing a role. And like any performance, it required coaching, practice, and constant refinement. Enter the explosion of women's magazines: Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's. These glossy publications weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals delivered monthly to millions of American doorsteps. Open any issue from that era and you'll find the same themes repeated like a mantra: how to keep your husband happy, how to raise obedient children, how to make your home more beautiful on less money. Articles had titles like The Care and Keeping of Husbands, Are You a Good Wife? And 10 Ways to Please Him Tonight. The tone was warm, sisterly even, but the underlying message was one of constant self-improvement in service to others, specifically in service to him. Advertisements played their part too, weaving obedience into the fabric of consumer culture. A woman scrubbing floors wasn't just cleaning, she was proving her love. A woman serving the perfect roast wasn't just cooking, she was demonstrating her worth. One famous ad for Chase and Sanborn coffee showed a husband spanking his wife over his knee with the caption, "If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee." The image was played for laughs, but the threat beneath it was real. Fail at your wifely duties, and there will be consequences. The kitchen became a laboratory of perfection. Women were expected to master complicated recipes from scratch. No shortcuts, no convenience foods. Those were for lazy wives. The pressure was immense. Cookbooks from the era didn't just provide recipes, they provided anxiety. Your husband works hard all day, one preface read. The least you can do is present him with a meal that shows you've worked hard too. And then there was the appearance standard. A 1950s housewife was expected to look immaculate at all times, even while cleaning toilets. Beauty guides instructed women to apply full makeup every morning before their husbands woke up. He should never see you looking anything less than lovely, advised one popular column. Hair was to be curled and set. Dresses were to be clean and fitted. Aprons were to be decorative, not functional looking. Even at home, even alone, a woman was always on display, always being judged, always performing femininity. The emotional labor was staggering. Women were taught to manage not just the physical home, but the emotional atmosphere of it. If her husband came home angry, it was her job to soothe him. If the children were loud, it was her failure to control them. If dinner was late, it was her fault for poor time management. The wife was the shock absorber for every stress, the invisible manager of everyone's feelings but her own. Maybe it wasn't just training. Maybe it was a silent expectation every woman felt, pressing down like humidity before a storm. But the training went even deeper than magazines and Sunday sermons. For women who wanted to truly excel, or whose families could afford it, there were charm schools. These institutions had names like the Patricia Stevens Finishing School and the John Robert Powers School for Social Grace. They promised to transform ordinary young women into paragons of elegance and poise. For a fee, girls and young women learned how to walk with books balanced on their heads, how to sit with their ankles crossed just so, how to enter a room and command attention without speaking a word. But it wasn't really about elegance. It was about control, teaching women to control their bodies, their voices, their natural impulses. Charm school students learned to speak softly, to laugh quietly, to never gesticulate wildly or take up too much space. They practiced getting in and out of cars without showing too much leg. They rehearsed conversation starters that were bright and cheerful but never too deep or controversial. One lesson often taught, how to lose an argument gracefully. Women were instructed in the art of yielding, how to disagree without seeming disagreeable, how to express an opinion without challenging male authority. A smart woman, one instructor told her class, knows how to make a man think an idea was his. These schools also taught the art of the entrance, how a wife should greet her husband at the end of the day. The door opens, she's already there, in the foyer, fresh-faced and smiling. She takes his coat. She offers him his slippers. She asks about his day, but not too many questions, nothing that feels like nagging. She presents the home as a peaceful refuge, problems solved before he even knew they existed. These TV mothers never yelled. They never burned dinner. They never collapsed on the couch in exhaustion. They solved every family problem with gentle wisdom and a warm smile, always deferring to their husbands for the final word. The message was broadcast into living rooms across America. This is what normal looks like. This is what good looks like. If you're struggling, if you're unhappy, if you're exhausted, you're the problem. And then there were the marriage manuals, those infamous guides that read like hostage negotiation tactics. Books like The Fascinating Womanhood and Maribel Morgan's Total Woman sold millions of copies. Their advice ranged from the absurd to the alarming. Women were told to greet their husbands at the door dressed in costumes, anything from a French maid outfit to saran wrap. They were told never to refuse sex, no matter how tired or uninterested they were. They were instructed to admire their husbands constantly, to build up their egos, to treat them like fragile kings who needed constant validation. One passage from a 1950s guide read, "Remember, your husband is the head of the household. Even if you disagree with his decisions, you must support them. To undermine his authority is to undermine the foundation of your marriage." Another advised, "If your husband criticizes you, don't become defensive. Listen carefully, apologize sincerely, and make changes. He only wants what's best for the family." The language was coded in sweetness, but the instruction was about power. His power, her submission. What's haunting about all this training is how it was sold as love. Women weren't told they were being controlled. They were told they were being equipped for happiness. The perfect home, the perfect appearance, the perfect obedience. These weren't chains, they were told. These were the keys to a fulfilling life. If you just tried hard enough, smiled bright enough, submitted gracefully enough, you'd be rewarded with security, respect, and love. But the reality was more complicated. Beneath those forced smiles and spotless kitchens, many women were silently drowning. Rates of depression among housewives in the 1950s were staggering, though rarely discussed. Doctors prescribed sedatives like Miltown and Valium, mother's little helpers, to women who couldn't articulate why they felt so empty, despite having everything they were told would make them happy. Betty Friedan would later call it the problem that has no name in her groundbreaking 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. She described the quiet desperation of educated, capable women who'd been trained to find fulfillment solely through their husbands and children, and discovered that fulfillment never came. The training had worked almost too well. Women had internalized the lesson so deeply that they blamed themselves for their unhappiness. If the magazines said this should make you happy, if the TV shows depicted it as perfection, if your mother and grandmother had done it without complaint, then the failure must be yours. The cost of obedience was often the self. Looking back now, it's easy to see the machinery at work. The schools, the churches, the magazines, the advertisements, the television shows, all working in concert to shape women into a very specific mold. It wasn't a conspiracy exactly. It was simply the way society organized itself, the way power maintained itself, the way one generation passed its expectations to the next. But here's what's important to remember. Those women weren't weak. They weren't naive. They were responding to the world they lived in with the tools they were given. In a time when women had few legal rights, when they couldn't get credit cards without their husband's signatures, when divorce meant social exile and financial ruin, obedience wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. The 1950s housewife, with her perfect curls and patient smile, wasn't the enemy of progress. She was a product of her time, doing what she'd been trained to do, believing what she'd been trained to believe. And when the next generation, the daughters raised in those immaculate homes, began to question, to rebel, to demand something different, they weren't rejecting their mothers. They were rejecting the training. They were asking a question that had been silenced for too long. What if a woman's worth wasn't measured by her obedience? What if there was another way to live? The answer to that question would reshape America. But that's a story for another time. For now, We can look back at those black and white photographs, the pressed aprons, the spotless kitchens, the radiant smiles, and recognize them for what they really were. Not just nostalgia, but evidence of a massive social project that trained millions of women to disappear into the background of their own lives. And maybe, just maybe, we can honor those women not by romanticizing their era, but by remembering the price they paid for that picture-perfect image, and by making sure we never train another generation to measure their worth by their willingness to obey.